Welcome to Kevin Deal Photography, where I take you on my journey through photography. On today's episode, we're going to be doing an in-depth review of the Fuji GF50mm 3.5 lens for the Fuji GFX system. I'm pleased to announce the release of my Capture One and Lightroom presets, Metamorphic Portraits, The Sound of Silver, and Rangefinder. These are all available for purchase at my website. Go to kevindealphotography.com or check out a link in the description below. And now, on to today's episode. Welcome to today's episode. If you're not familiar with Kevin Deal Photography, we do gear reviews, tips, techniques, and tutorials, and sometimes we dive into film. If any of that sounds appealing to you, click the subscribe button below. So if you follow this channel, you've probably seen that I've done reviews of other GFX lenses like the GF110, the GF63, and the GF45. But kind of lost in the shuffle in my GFX GF lineup is the 3.5. It's a very small lens, and it looks like it's great for compact work like street photography, vacation, and all that. And we'll explore that in today's episode. But those other lenses are so great that sometimes I feel like I neglect this guy, and I have had him for quite a while. I took a step back. I looked at the body of work I've done with him, and I was actually really surprised at how many amazing pictures I've taken with this lens. So, in today's episode, we are going to explore, maybe you are on the fence, you're looking at this lens, you're considering it. We're going to put it through its paces. We'll shoot some street photography, we'll shoot some portraiture, we'll shoot some other genres of photography. But first, let's talk about the specs. The Fuji GF50mm f3.5 RLMWR lens is an autofocus non-image stabilized lens for the Fuji GFX system. Its perspective is equivalent to 40mm in full frame. It's also a WR lens, which means it has weather sealing. It has a maximum aperture of f3.5 and a minimum aperture of f32. It has an angle of view of 57.4 degrees. It has a minimum focusing distance of 1.8 feet or 55 centimeters. It has 9 elements in 6 groups, and it has 9 rounded aperture blades. It has a magnification of 0.1. It has a front filter thread size of 62 millimeters. Its dimensions are 3.31 by 1.89 inches or 89 by 48 millimeters. Its weight is 11.82 ounces or 335 grams. And it comes in at a street price of $999 US. So now that we've heard the specs, let's take this guy out into the field and see what kind of shots we can get with him.
All right, so I am here in the Alamo City where I want to test out this 50mm 3.5. I want to see how sharp it is. I want to see how good the autofocus is. And truth be told, 45mm is actually my favorite focal length for the entire GFX system. And this is only 5mm longer. So let's see what kind of a difference this makes for general photography, for street photography. And it also is a 2.8 on the 45 versus a 3.5. Now, in terms of light collection and depth of field, that's not that big of a deal, but the minimum focusing distance is about 1.6 feet or 55 centimeters on this 50mm, whereas it's about a half a foot less and about 10 centimeters closer on this 2.8. So we'll see what kind of a difference that actually makes if you're the type of photographer who likes to get right up to things and get subject isolation. We'll of course test this out. We'll remember the Alamo. We will take a picture with the 50mm and the 45mm, and we'll see which lens will help you remember the Alamo more. We'll try it to stop down to like, I don't know, 7.1 or something like that, so we can do a sharpness test. And I'll also test out the minimum focusing distance between the two lenses and tell you which one I prefer. So let's get started.
So I'm just gonna cut to the chase. This lens packs quite a punch. It was incredibly sharp. The subject isolation on it is fantastic. But the burning question for all of you is, between this and the 45, which one did a better job of remembering the Alamo? Well, I do have my preferences in terms of focal length, but in terms of sharpness and optical quality, it really was hard to tell the difference between the 50 and 45mm lenses. So I guess that means further testing was required, so I jumped in my car and I headed south to the city of Floresville, where I took pictures of their historic, beautiful downtown, and it further proved to me that this 50mm 3.5 was a great walk-around lens. But even that wasn't convincing enough because I wanted to take this guy on a journey. So I headed even further south, another 4 hours to the US-Mexico border to the lovely city of McAllen.
So I'm sure a lot of you who purchase this lens are wanting to use it for your trip, for street photography, general walk-around photography. And so I'm gonna do that here in McAllen, Texas, which is here in the Rio Grande Valley. I'm gonna do some golden hour street photography. I'm gonna grab some dinner, some good Mexican dinner, and then I'm gonna test out this 3.5 maximum aperture because I wanna see how well this guy does at night, because I've tested out the 45 and the 63 2.8 and they kind of seem like they're teetering on the edge of what I prefer to see in terms of maximum aperture. So we're gonna see if this 3.5 gets the job done in darkness. But yeah, let's do some stuff while it's still sunny out first.
Nestled in the Rio Grande Valley, you have photo-rich environments in these border cities like Mission, Roma, Rio Grande City, and McAllen. The splintered wood, the rough bricks, and the stripped-down old leather paint provided me with the perfect backdrop to test out the 53.5 and how it resolves detail. I also use this opportunity to try out some custom film recipes, Vivid, and a turn of bleach bypass, which I think gave me a nice spectrum of testing out how this lens captures color. And in my bread and butter of portraiture, I did find myself using this on occasional shoots. I put the 110, the 63, and the 45 aside to try out the 50 to see how well it does for portraiture. And as you can see right here, it's a professional looking lens. So if you find yourself needing to shoot portraits and you don't have the money for the 45 or the 110, you can use this 50 and produce fantastic results. So now that I've run over a year and a half worth of pictures through this lens in general, street, and even my professional genre of portraiture, let's talk about the pros and cons of this lens, who should buy it, who should pass on it, and whether or not it's a great value.
Okay, so I have over a year and a half of experience with the 50mm 3.5. So let's talk about the pros and cons of this lens, and let's start with the pros. It's incredibly light and it's incredibly small. It's the smallest lens for the entire Fuji GF lineup, and it's meant to optimize well on a 100 megapixel sensor. So if you're looking at that $999 price tag and you wonder where this guy stacks up, well, let's talk about the image quality, because that's probably the biggest selling point of this tiny lens. It's from the same pedigree as the 45 2.8 and the 63 2.8. It's definitely up there with those lenses in terms of image quality. It is definitely better than the similarly priced 35 to 70, which I did a review of, and you can check that out in the link in the description below. And it's a fantastic lens, don't get me wrong, but it's not as sharp as this lens. You could see when I did my comparison at the Alamo, the 50 versus the 45, I really couldn't tell a difference between the two lenses. Sometimes I might prefer the 45 in certain areas of the frame. In other areas, I preferred the 50. And so that just lets me believe that it's really close and you really can't declare one the winner. Wide open, I thought it definitely hung with the 45 2.8 as well. So it can resolve well on a 100 megapixel sensor, and that to me absolutely justifies the $999 price tag of it. So if you're wondering if this is like a kit 50mm like you get in the full frame world, that is absolutely not the case.
In terms of bokeh, I thought it was pretty pleasing to the eye. It wasn't as good as the 2.8, but it was pretty close. And when I shot it against the sun, there was really controlled flaring. It wasn't out of control. There wasn't a lot of chromatic aberration, which proves to me that this lens really is in the same pedigree as the 45 and 63mm siblings. In terms of autofocus motor volume, I thought it was pretty quiet. In terms of autofocus speed, for Fuji GF50, this is among one of the faster lenses I've tested, and if you have one of the newer models, it's gonna move even faster than my 100S.
This lens also has a WR designation, so it is weather resistant, and that's good if you are a street photographer or you're on vacation and it starts to rain. The lens matches your body in terms of the fact that it is resistant to the weather, and that of course also is the case if you're on the beach and the dust starts kicking around, the sand starts kicking around. So that's a positive in my opinion. It is weather resistant. For you Fuji purists out there, it also has the aperture ring that you all love, and you can put it in auto mode, or you can even put it in the C mode if you are like me and you just want to use that rear command dial to adjust your aperture. But let's walk around and let's talk about the things that we don't like on this lens, because there are some things that fall short. All right, so I'm here in downtown McAllen, Texas, and I tested out the 50mm 3.5 in the exact same places I was just at before I went and got my awesome Mexican food, which I'm really full from. And no, man, I gotta say, 3.5 is just too dark even for a medium format like this. I think 1.8 or f2 is about my cutoff for full frame and APS-C, and so even in the medium format world with its light collection abilities, I think 3.5 is too dark. I had to keep the ISO at like 3200, and we're talking when we have the shutter speed at like a 30th or slower. So if you want to freeze any motion whatsoever, you're going to have to keep it 6400, 12800, and even then you may not entirely freeze what you're trying to freeze. So this guy, unfortunately, not the greatest performer in low light, and so I'm going to put that under the cons.
To further clarify my position, I'm not saying this lens doesn't take great pictures at night. It absolutely does. It just depends on what you're trying to capture. If your subject is still, you can probably hand hold it, especially with IBIS, and take great pictures, as you can see right here. But if you want to freeze motion, you're still going to need something like a 1.4 or maybe a 1.8 lens, which this is not. Another con of this lens is debatable, but for me, I like to walk right up to things and take pictures of it. There are times when the minimum focusing distance on this is just fine, but it is 10 centimeters longer, or a half a foot longer, than the 45 2.8. So if minimum focusing distance is important to you, you may want to check out that lens instead.
Okay, so now to perhaps my least favorite thing about this lens, and that's simply the focal length. At the end of the day, when I shoot street, I'm a 45mm guy. On full frame, I'm a 35mm guy. As a matter of fact, the shot you're seeing right now is being shot on a Canon full frame 35mm. On the Fuji X mount, I like 23mm. And I just ran into issues where compositionally, I would be pressed up against the wall, which means that I can't actually get any further back. And the focal length just didn't fit everything that I wanted in the shot. It was just too tight. And you can see from these examples below, when I was in San Antonio, I would be cutting off people's feet. The shot of the Alamo, the 45 pulled off that famous shot of the Alamo where you're standing in between the Texas and the American flag, and the 50 was too tight. Again, there was a shot of the cathedral in downtown San Antonio, and I wanted to have 3 chairs in the foreground. I abandoned the shot with this lens because I couldn't get it to line up the way I wanted to. I didn't actually get it to line up the way I wanted to on the 45, but that was my fault, not the lens's fault. I should have had it centered a little better. And so I just don't like the focal length. I want it to be about 5mm further back, and with a 100 megapixel sensor, if I am too far back, I can always crop. Now, if I'm shooting down the street like I am here, I can go across the street and take a picture of this Chase building as a car's going by, and I think it does a pretty good job. But when I'm standing in a downtown area shooting street, I may want to tell a story and I can't get the environment the way I want to get it with this 50mm. So you have to think about the type of photography that you like to do and the way you like to compose your shots, because for me, I can't recommend the 50mm. I have to recommend the 45 for the way I like to tell stories. So if you're a little bit more subject oriented and you want to get a little closer to the subject, this may be good for you. But if you want a little bit more of your story to be about your environment, I say pass on this lens. You're probably better off going with the 45 2.8. And if that's too expensive for you, go to the 35 to 70, because that lens, while it isn't as bright as this lens, it's still a pretty sharp lens and it's similarly priced. And so that's really the biggest con of this lens, is I just don't get along with the focal length, and it also isn't that great in my opinion for nighttime photography, especially handheld, even with IBIS. So that's something to keep in mind. But do you have the 50mm 3.5? Do you like it? Tell me about it in the comments below. Did you buy this lens? Did you skip this lens? Obviously the optical quality on it is fantastic. If you like this channel, I humbly ask you to click the subscribe button below. And until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.